In a house draped in mourning, a sealed will shatters the quiet. Katrina Lorne has 7 days to accept the Marquess of Stratharden or lose her honor and her home. Candles gutter. Footsteps pause. Somewhere behind the walls, a hidden passage waits, and an old sin stirs. Duty demands obedience. Desire whispers of a different fate. Is the Marquess her rescuer or the final architect of her ruin? One signature could save a legacy or bury a secret that refuses to stay dead. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you listening from? And what do you love most about period romances? The forbidden longing, the social stakes, or the triumph against scandal? Edinburgh, Scotland, the year of our Lord, 1822. The city lay draped in a curtain of hoarfrost, its narrow winds slick with ice and silence. Smoke curled from chimney pots across Newtown, and the high bells of St. Giles echoed through the crisp morning air like a warning. Inside Lorne House, where morning drapes darkened every window, and the scent of extinguished candles clung to the velvet draperies, Miss Katrina Lorne stood alone in the drawing room, dressed in a gown of deep slate grey, the colour of fading thunderclouds. Her hands, clad in black kid gloves, remained folded tightly in front of her as the solicitor finished reading the will that should have secured her future. Instead, it unravelled it. "You have until the 7th day," Mr. Bellamy repeated, his voice clipped with Edinburgh formality, "to either accept the proposed marriage or relinquish all rights to the estate." Katrina's gaze did not waver. The hazel green of her eyes, neither soft nor sharp, but solemn, remained fixed on the roaring hearth behind him. The flames danced, indifferent. The embers whispered secrets the dead had no business keeping. "My father did not believe in ultimatums," she said at last, her voice low and steady, with a Highland lilt softened by the precision of schooling. "And yet he has left me one." Bellamy cleared his throat. It appears this clause was added only weeks before his passing, witnessed by the estate's legal agent and sealed under proper authority. She did not ask who the intended groom was. Not yet. She merely nodded once, as though anchoring herself to a floor that had shifted beneath her boots. The solicitor hesitated before continuing, as if sensing the magnitude of the name he was about to utter. "The man your father deemed suitable, perhaps even necessary, is the Marquess of Stratharden." Silence fell like snowfall, soundless, sudden, and absolute. Katrina turned her head slowly, the tight braid at her nape pulling gently with the movement. "Alistair MacRae," she whispered. Even the fire seemed to pause. Bellamy gave a respectful nod. "Yes, my lady, the very one." It could not have been a more precise blow. The Marquess of Stratharden was not merely a peer of power. He was a legend of legal cunning, a Highland noble tempered by years in England's courts, known for his brutal efficiency, his disinterest in society's diversions, and the chilling silence that followed his judgments. She had seen him only once before, from across the cathedral aisle at a winter funeral 2 years prior. He had not spoken, he had not smiled. And yet his presence had possessed the church like a ghost that refused to be buried. Katrina could not imagine him inside Lorne House, and yet now she would have to. "I shall need time to consider," she said, her voice calm, though something behind her ribs had begun to splinter. "You have 6 days remaining, my lady," Bellamy corrected with cool finality. "1 was spent in notification. The count began yesterday." She inclined her head and dismissed him with a flicker of her fingers, more out of habit than hauteur. When the door closed behind him, she stood very still, her eyes fixed on the ledger shelf beneath the window. Her father's records, the orphan's school, the foundation of the Lorne legacy, 7 days or less. A marriage of convenience to a man of stone, or ruin. By afternoon, the clouds had gathered into a pewter sky, and Katrina rode to the edge of the estate's south field, the wind snapping at the hem of her wool riding cloak. She needed air, clean and biting. She needed distance from the walls that still murmured her father's name. But she found no clarity in the frost-bitten landscape, only the heaviness of winter pressing down upon the house and her chest alike. That evening she sent for her late father's clerk to retrieve the visitor list from his final month, and she penned a letter, brief, formal, cold, to the Marquess of Stratharden. It bore no sentiment, only a request. My lord, as per the stipulations left in my late father's will, I am informed that your name was affixed to a matter of great consequence. I request your presence at Lorne House at your earliest convenience. Miss Katrina Lorne. She did not reread it. She did not seal it with wax scented of lavender, as she once had for her mother. She pressed her signet to the fold, handed it to the footman, and retired to her study without lighting a candle. He would come. She was certain of that. What she did not expect, what she could not anticipate, was how much her hands would tremble as she waited. And when he arrived the next afternoon, with his black top hat removed but not his guarded expression, she knew immediately why her father had chosen him. He did not offer condolences, nor flattery, nor false comfort, only a quiet, assessing nod as he stepped into the drawing-room, and a single sentence. "You summoned me, Miss Lorne. Shall we begin?" She met his gaze without flinching, and so it began. Snow had begun to fall in thin, weightless threads by the time Katrina entered the old study, where the scent of her father's pipe still lingered in the carved panels of the shelves. The fire crackled low, casting an amber glow across the ledger books, arranged with ritualistic precision, each spine bearing her father's elegant looping script. Outside the mullioned windows, dusk settled over the gardens like a hush before confession. Inside, silence reigned until the door opened. Alistair MacRae entered with the same economy of movement he had shown the day before, his dark coat free of snow, his gloved hands holding a small leather folio. He did not bow, nor did she curtsy. They merely regarded one another, two figures forged by duty, now bound by a contract neither had written. "You asked to speak privately," she said, her tone clipped but composed. "I did." His voice was low and even, a Highland resonance tempered by legal precision. "What I am about to share may place both of us in danger, but I believe you value truth over comfort." "I value clarity," she replied. "Begin." He stepped forward and placed the folio on the edge of her father's desk, flipping it open with a single gloved finger. Inside were letters, receipts, notarized statements. Katrina drew closer, her gaze moving with speed and precision over the inked lines. "What am I looking at?" "Disbursements from the estate, particularly funds allocated to the school and to orphan welfare accounts, appear to have been diverted for over a year." She lifted one of the documents, her brow tightening. "These figures were never entered into the household books. They were concealed, cross-referenced under false expenditure codes. Your father was meticulous, Miss Lorne, which is precisely why these inconsistencies raised concern." She looked up sharply. "You had access to his private accounts?" Alistair met her gaze without flinching. "No, but I had reason to request a financial profile when I was approached about the marriage, as a precaution." "You profiled him?" "I investigated him," he corrected, "and now I'm investigating what killed him." The words landed like a blow. Katrina said nothing at first. The fire popped behind them, a soft percussion to a room suddenly colder. "You believe he was—" She stopped herself, drawing a breath that tasted of ash. "He died of fever." "He did, but he signed a revised will in the final week of his life, in a hand that does not match his earlier writings. The solicitor claims it was dictated due to weakness. I have my doubts. And you thought to keep this from me? I thought to confirm it before I said more. I do not deal in speculation, Miss Lorne, only in fact." Katrina turned away, walking to the window where the frost had begun to bloom against the glass like pale petals. She pressed her hand to the sill. Her gloves creaked softly with the motion. She was too still, too silent. "I will see the household ledgers myself," she said at last, her voice quieter. "No one knows their structure better than I do. If something was hidden, I will find it. He inclined his head. Then we work together. She turned back slowly. Let us be clear on one point, my lord. I do not trust you. I do not trust your interest in this estate, nor your silence until now. But I will use your information, and I expect you to honor the same principle. Alistair's lips twitched, the shadow of a smile without warmth. Spoken like a lawn. They worked side by side for nearly an hour, in a silence charged not with awkwardness, but with discipline. Katrina's movements were swift, exact, her fingers flipping through ledgers with the ease of familiarity. Alistair, by contrast, read slowly, methodically, his eyes scanning not just figures but margins, annotations, the occasional smudge that revealed more than ink. At one point their hands brushed just barely over a page. Katrina's fingers tensed. She did not move away, nor did he. The contact was brief, but in that second, a current passed between them, subtle and inexplicable. Something wordless, something ancient. She drew her hand back a beat too late to be casual. There, she said, clearing her throat. That entry. A linen delivery doubled in cost, twice in the same quarter. No corresponding inventory increase. But the funds were logged under medical supply expenses. Alistair leaned in to examine the page, his shoulder brushing hers. His breath, warm and even, stirred a curl that had slipped from her braid. That is not the only one, he murmured. Look here. Coal shipments recorded, but the merchant's stamp is missing. The same merchant who later sued 3 tenants for unpaid rents. All with links to Hector Muir's holdings. Katrina stiffened. My father's cousin. Alistair nodded. He has shown a keen interest in Lorne House since your father's passing. That interest is not new, she said, her voice dipping. He visited me yesterday, brought flowers for the parlour and a warning dressed in silk. Alistair straightened. What sort of warning? That I should accept the generous opportunity my father arranged, that in times of political instability, a woman of my station ought not be without a man's guidance. He scoffed. And what guidance would Hector offer? Gambling debts and public disgrace. Katrina turned her face toward the fire, her profile etched in gold and shadow. He offered a smile. That was the most threatening part. There was silence between them, thicker now. You believe he had a hand in the will? She asked. I believe he had motive, and I no longer believe he acts alone. He walked toward the hearth, his tall frame silhouetted against the flames. The firelight caught the silver at his temples, gave depth to the hollows beneath his cheekbones. He looked not like a suitor, nor even a savior, but like a man who had long since given up waiting for warmth and made peace with the cold. Katrina watched him in silence. There was something about his stillness that unnerved her, not passivity, but calculation, as though even his silences were tactics. And what of you, my lord? She asked softly. What do you seek to gain from all this? He turned to face her. You ask the question too late, Miss Lorne. I am already implicated. If I walk away now, your enemies will presume my guilt. And if you stay, she challenged, then I stay until the truth is unearthed, whether that truth favors me or not. She studied him. In the quiet hush of the study, surrounded by ink and fire, paper and suspicion, she realized that this man was not here to court her, nor to save her. He was here to dig, and if she let him dig deep enough, she feared he might find not only her father's secrets, but her own. Outside, the snow fell in earnest, muffling the city into stillness. But within the walls of Lorne House, 2 minds worked like clockwork gears, grinding toward a revelation neither was prepared to name. And behind a far door, just beyond earshot, a footman lingered too long in the corridor, his shadow etched on the wall. Someone was listening, and someone else had just begun to move. The snow had grown heavier overnight, blanketing Edinburgh in a hush that muffled the city's usual clatter and softened even the harsh edges of stone and smoke. Lorne House stood like a relic suspended in time, its windows glowing faintly from within, its thresholds cloaked in silence. But beneath its elegant symmetry and carved gables, something else stirred, something hidden, long buried beneath years of order and grief. It began with a scent. Katrina paused at the threshold of the library, her gloved hand lingering on the doorframe. A draught had crept through the hearth, not cold, but damp, tinged with earth and something older. She had smelled it before, years ago, on a night when her father had come in from the grounds, soaked to the bone, and had forbidden her to ever ask why. Now, standing alone in the room, lit only by the flicker of a wall sconce, she inhaled that same breath of soil and time. Her eyes swept the room. Books lined the walls like sentinels. The hearth was unlit. A velvet curtain hung partially drawn across the southern alcove, behind which rested the tall mahogany shelves her father had used for ledgers and maps. She stepped forward slowly. Her boots made no sound on the thick carpet. When she tugged the curtain aside, she saw it, a narrow gap behind the shelves, barely a hand's width, but the candlelight revealed scratches along the floor, scrapes in the wood, curved and deliberate, as if the entire shelf had once been moved. She did not hesitate. With both hands she gripped the edges of the mahogany and pressed her weight forward. It did not yield. A voice behind her made her freeze. "You're not imagining things, Alistair." He stepped into the library without apology, still in his greatcoat, speckled with snow that melted in quiet rivulets along the collar. He looked at the shelves, then at her. "You've seen it too," she said. "I saw the same scent," he murmured. "Old earth, and I noticed the floor scarring 2 nights ago. I didn't mention it." "Why not?" "I wasn't sure what I'd find, or how you'd respond to what we might uncover." He moved beside her and placed one hand low on the shelf's inner panel. His fingers found a slight ridge, a hidden groove, and he pressed. A mechanism clicked, soft as a sigh. The bookcase creaked. A portion of it shuddered, then swung forward on a concealed hinge, revealing a narrow stone corridor beyond, dark and cold and damp as a crypt. Katrina inhaled, and the air that met her lungs was thick with moisture, and the faint scent of mold and rusted iron. The stone walls were rough and uneven, the passage barely wide enough for 2. Alistair held out a lantern he had brought with him, its light trembling across the threshold. "After you," he said. She stepped inside without a word. The cold wrapped around them immediately. The passage sloped downward, the incline subtle but insistent. Their footsteps echoed softly against the stone. Katrina moved carefully, holding the folds of her dress close. The walls pressed in on both sides, and the air grew heavier the deeper they walked. "It's older than the house," she whispered. "This tunnel." Alistair nodded. "It predates the current structure, possibly part of the original foundation. The Lorne family built over something they never wanted to explain." At the end of the passage, they reached a small chamber carved into the stone. Here, the air shifted, less stagnant, touched with the whisper of wind. In the center sat a rusted iron chest and a pile of burlap sacks, damp and half-rotted. Katrina knelt beside the chest and opened the latch. Inside lay a stack of folded papers, some brittle, others ink-dark and recent. Letters, ledgers, signed agreements. She lifted one. The handwriting was familiar, but it wasn't her father's. "It's his seal," she murmured, her voice trembling, "but this is not his hand." Alistair leaned closer. "The ledgers are in cipher," he said. "Basic code, dates shifted, names abbreviated, amounts transposed." He reached for one of the pages, his hand brushing hers. They both froze. The air between them contracted, warm despite the cold. Katrina met his gaze, and in that flickering half-light, his storm-grey eyes held something unguarded. She felt the moment shift, like the slowing of a clock when the world holds its breath. She pulled her hand away, slowly. "Whoever did this," she said softly, "had access. They forged documents beneath this house. They walked these halls, and they used my father's name." "There's more," Alistair murmured. He moved to the back wall of the chamber and pressed his hand to a stone marked by soot. With effort, He shifted it aside, revealing a second passage. This one climbed upward, tight and steep. "It leads to Parliament Close," he said. "I found the grate earlier this week, just before I received your summons." Katrina stared at him. "You've been investigating this alone?" He didn't look at her. "There are things I haven't spoken aloud, because once spoken, they cannot be undone." She stepped closer. "Then say them." He turned to her, slowly. "I believe someone wanted your father's estate vulnerable. I believe Lord Hector is involved, but I also believe he is not the architect. He is too greedy, too careless. This," he gestured to the chest, "this was orchestrated by someone with patience, someone close." The implication was clear. Someone still within the household. Katrina's breath caught. "I will find the cipher's key," she said firmly. "I know my father's patterns, his habits, his fears. If there's a message buried in this ink, I will read it." He nodded, admiring the quiet steel in her voice. "You were never meant to be ornamental, were you?" he asked softly. She looked at him, unblinking. "No." Outside the tunnel, the wind howled through the iron grate above. Snow was falling hard now, muffling footsteps, cloaking streets, erasing tracks. When they emerged from the hidden passage behind the stables, they were shivering but alert, each step charged with the knowledge that everything had shifted. Back inside Lorne House, Alistair helped her unfasten her cloak, their fingers brushing at the collar. Neither spoke of it, but in the stillness of the entryway, something lingered. A warmth, a pulse, an ache. Their alliance was no longer a matter of legality. It was a matter of breath and blood, and it had only just begun. The frost had thickened into ice, spreading across the iron gates and stone balustrades of Lorne House like a veil of suspicion. Even the morning light filtering through the east windows carried a different hue, dulled by the heavy skies and a tension that now seemed to breathe through the very walls. It was not just the weight of winter that lingered in the corridors, it was the weight of eyes. Catriona Lorne stood at the front window of the drawing room, her hands resting on the sill, gloved fingers lightly tapping in quiet rhythm. From her vantage point, she could see the drive that curved down toward the gates, where the servants had begun clearing the snow with stiff brushes and shovels. Beyond the wrought iron, shadows moved behind lace-curtained carriages. Visitors had come again this morning. 3 ladies from Newtown, clad in velvet capes trimmed with fur and smiles as thin as paper. They had brought flowers and gossip. Katrina had received them with the graciousness required of her station, offering tea in the drawing room where her mother's portrait still hung. But even their courtesies had edges. Every compliment was followed by a glance, every question laced with unspoken meaning. They did not ask about her grief. They asked whether she would host guests by spring, whether she still planned to remain at Lorne House once the affairs were settled, whether the Marquess of Stratharden had already taken up residence. When they departed, she had burned the flowers. Now, standing alone once more, she wondered how many more wagging tongues would make their way down Queen Street, how many would stitch her name into parlours and parlours into scandal. Mourning, it seemed, had an expiration date, and hers had passed the moment a man had crossed her threshold. Footsteps echoed behind her. She did not turn. "I suppose you heard," she murmured. "I did," Alistair replied. His voice was quiet, but something in it sharpened the air between them. She could sense his gaze upon her back. It wasn't cold, but precise. He measured things others overlooked, posture, breath, the tremor in a teacup. "They're spreading it already, aren't they?" she asked. "The lies, that I have no shame, that I invited you to my table and my bed." He did not respond at first. Then softly, "It is not shame they resent, it is power, and you wield it with more grace than they ever learned to endure." Katrina turned then, slowly. Their eyes met. It was a long silence, not of hesitation, but of knowing. In the heavy pause between them, the truth settled like dust in an undisturbed room. They had become more than adversaries, more than allies. They were witnesses to each other's solitude. "You received something this morning," she said, shifting her tone. "A letter." Alistair stepped forward and removed a folded paper from the inner pocket of his coat. He handed it to her without preamble. The seal was unfamiliar. Plain, red wax, no crest. Inside, a single sentence, penned in an unsteady hand. "The fire in the orphanage was lit from within." Katrina read the words twice, her stomach tightening. "What is this?" "It arrived unsigned," Alistair said. "But the script matches a ledger entry we found in the tunnel. Someone is trying to reach us, someone with knowledge." She looked up. "One of the staff. Or someone posing as one. Either way, it suggests what we feared, that there's a hand inside your house playing both sides." Katrina's thoughts leapt to the school, the children, the few trusted employees who had remained despite the rumors, and one name came unbidden to her lips. Mrs. Kerr. The matron had served the Lorne family for nearly 2 decades, loyal, quiet, dutiful. But in times like these, even loyalty could be used as cover. Katrina hated herself for thinking it, but the seed had been planted. "I need to speak with her," she said, folding the paper. "But not confront. Not yet. I want to watch her." Alistair nodded. "I already have someone posted by the East Corridor, discreetly." Her breath caught, not with fear, but with something else. An unease at how far he had gone, how quickly he moved in shadows. "Why are you doing all this?" she asked quietly. "Is it truly the truth you seek or something else?" He stepped closer, and for a moment the space between them dissolved into warmth, into stillness. "Because I've seen what injustice does when left unchecked," he said. "And because something in you refuses to bend. That's worth guarding." Katrina looked away, unable to meet the heat in his eyes. Her pulse fluttered like a sparrow against her ribs. Outside, a sudden cry broke the moment. A child's scream. She ran to the window, yanked it open. In the yard, one of the children from the school, young Elsie, no more than 7, was sprawled on the icy path beside the main carriage. A wheel had come loose and collapsed. The driver rushed forward, panic clear on his face. Katrina was already halfway down the corridor when Alistair caught up to her. Together, they burst through the front doors, into the cutting air. Elsie's leg was twisted beneath her, her sobs sharp and thin like breaking glass. The wheel lay splintered beside her. "It just rolled off, miss," the driver stammered. "I swear it was secured. I checked it myself not 10 minutes ago." Katrina knelt beside the child, whispering softly, brushing snow from her forehead. Behind her, Alistair examined the axle, his expression darkening. "The pin was tampered with," he said grimly. "Clean cut. Deliberate." Katrina's blood ran cold. This was no longer rumor. It was sabotage. Later, after Elsie had been carried inside and attended by the physician, Katrina stood alone in the stables. The air smelled of hay and iron, the light dim from a lantern hanging near the stall door. She leaned against the wooden post, her thoughts thick with dread. Alistair found her there. He didn't speak at first, only stood beside her, silent as snowfall. When he finally did speak, his voice was quiet, but firm. "I've posted men around the perimeter. Trusted men. The house is watched." She didn't answer, her hands clenched at her sides. "I am offering you protection," he continued, "but if you won't accept it as a legal obligation, then accept it as something else." She turned to him. Her face was pale in the lantern light, her eyes fierce and wet with unshed fury. "As what, my lord? As a woman you pity? As a cause? As a debt owed to your conscience?" He stepped closer, his breath warm against the cold. "No," he said, "as a woman I admire, and as a battle I've already chosen." Their eyes locked. The tension between them was no longer theoretical. It breathed, it burned, but neither stepped beyond it. Not yet, not tonight. And as the lantern swayed above them, casting flickering shadows across the stable walls, Katrina knew one thing with chilling clarity. Whoever had set their sights on Lorne House was no longer playing at threats. They were declaring war. The wind that evening carried a bitterness sharper than snow. It curled through the chimneys of Lorne House like a warning, rattling the panes and pressing against the windows with restless fingers. Inside, the drawing room had been warmed by fire, but no heat could quite touch the chill that clung to Katrina's skin. She stood by the hearth, her arms folded tightly across her chest, the folds of her plum-wool dress catching the flicker of flame. Her hair was pinned in its usual simple braid, yet a few strands had come loose, softened by the weight of the day and the burden of its discoveries. Behind her, the door clicked shut. She did not turn. "I expected you," she said quietly. Alistair McRae's voice came from the shadows, calm and steady. "I gave the factor my response. And he understands now that I am not here as a spectator." He stepped into the light. "Nor as a stranger." Katrina turned slowly. The light of the fire reached only half his face, carving his expression into planes of shadow and revelation. His cravat had been loosened, just slightly, enough to show the tension in his throat. Snow still clung to the shoulders of his coat, and the scent of frost and oak clung to him as if he had brought the night in with him. "You look as though you've walked through a storm," she murmured. "I have," he replied, "but not the kind you think." He moved toward her, not with urgency, but with purpose, and still she did not step back. "Miss Lorne," he began, his voice lower now, almost rough. "I have delayed saying this for longer than was wise. Not for lack of intention, but for lack of certainty as to how it might be received." She said nothing, her breath slowed. Alistair continued, "I did not come to this house to fulfill a clause or rescue a reputation. I came because your father, before his death, entrusted me with a secret. When he did not wish to place in writing," her heart skipped. What sort of secret? That if anything should happen to him suddenly, unnaturally, he suspected the estate would be targeted from within. He did not know by whom, but he feared that someone close, someone trusted, would exploit his absence. Katrina's hands tightened around her arms. "And he chose you?" "I told him I would ensure Lorne House would not fall into unworthy hands." He paused. "He asked me to consider marrying you." She blinked. The words struck her like a stone tossed into still water, too blunt to be poetic, too honest to be dismissed. "And you accepted," she said, her voice almost inaudible. "No," he replied. "I did not answer, not then." He stepped closer. "I have never seen myself as a husband, Miss Lorne, nor as a protector. I am a man of law, of quiet corridors and long games. I have buried my emotions beneath obligations and let my solitude shield me from weakness." His tone deepened. "But then I watched you stand before fire and rumor and ruin without flinching. I saw you hold a child's hand and read a ciphered ledger in the same breath. I saw you bleed and refuse to show it, and I remembered what it is to believe in something." The fire cracked behind her. She swallowed once. "What is it, then, that you believe in now?" she asked. He looked at her, and for the first time since she had known him, something raw flickered in his eyes, something naked and unspeakably human. "You." The silence that followed was not empty. It was thick with meaning, pulsing with everything left unsaid. He reached into his coat and drew out a small, weathered ring, gold with an unpolished garnet set in a simple band. "My mother wore this when she first came to Stratharden," he said softly. "It's not grand, but it endured 3 decades of storms." Catriona looked at the ring but did not touch it. "You offer it now," she said, "because the house is under threat." "No," he replied. "I offer it now because you are." She lifted her chin. "And if there were no danger," his jaw tightened, "then I would offer it all the same. But I would not have the excuse of urgency to hide behind." A silence fell between them, fragile, suspended. Then softly she said, "You once told me that you were betrayed by a woman who chose reputation over truth." He drew a breath. "She did," he said. "We were young. She was a viscount's daughter. I was the second son of a Highland laird. She loved poetry and flattered my ambition, but when her father learned of our intentions, he threatened disinheritance. She said she would run away. Instead, she married a man 3 weeks later with more coin than courage. Katrina's gaze never left his face. You still wear the wound. I do. And you thought I might do the same. He hesitated. I feared it. A long moment passed. Then she stepped forward, and gently she closed his fingers around the ring. I am not her, she whispered. No, he said, you are not. She took another breath, deep, steady. But neither am I a prize to be claimed when convenient, she added. I cannot marry a man who sees me as a solution. Alistair flinched, but only slightly. She stepped back, her hands now at her sides, her voice clear despite the heat behind her ribs. I need to know that when I stand beside a man, it is not because I was placed there by a will or protected there by force, but because I chose to stand beside him. Not as shield, not as burden, but as equal. The air in the room changed. The fire dimmed, then flared. The clock above the hearth ticked. Soft and sure, 3 days remained. He bowed his head, and with the faintest smile, not of victory, but of reverence, he said, Then I will wait. And when he left the room, closing the door behind him, Katrina turned back to the fire, her fingers trembling as they brushed the fabric of her gown. She had refused him. But she had also given him something rarer than agreement. She had given him a beginning, and in the silence of the flames, she felt the weight of his story settle within her, an echo that would not be forgotten. Not now, not ever. It began with the scent of smoke, not the warm, comforting aroma of peat in the hearth, nor the lingering sweetness of pine logs burning in the drawing room. This was different, acrid, bitter. A sharp bite to the back of the throat that crept in through the cracks beneath the servants' doors and settled like fog in the corridors of Lorne House. Katrina Lorne awoke before the bell sounded. Her eyes flew open in the darkness, and before she could even rise from her bed, she heard the pounding of hurried boots on the stone floors below, the frantic creak of door hinges, the distant shouting of her name through the stairwell. She threw a shawl around her shoulders and stepped barefoot into the hallway. The air was cold, but it wasn't the chill that made her skin rise in gooseflesh. It was the unmistakable stench now filling the air. She raced toward the servants' wing, only to see one of the younger maids run past her in tears. "The schoolhouse, miss," the girl sobbed. "It's the children's wing. It's burning." Katrina didn't hesitate. She ran. Out into the courtyard, into the wind that sliced against her face like glass. Snow fell steadily, but it was no match for the orange glow that now rose behind the stables, where the orphanage's eastern wing stood engulfed in angry flame. Sparks leapt skyward in gusts of wind, and the black silhouette of the rooftop glowed red at the seams. Children were crying. Shouts echoed from every direction. 2 stable boys struggled to form a line to the well, their hands trembling from cold and panic. Mrs. Kerr, hair undone and apron half-singed, stood in the doorway trying to count the girls as they were ushered out, one by one, barefoot, coughing, shivering. Katrina's heart pounded. "Elsie, Nora, Mary," she called, naming them like a prayer. "Still inside," someone shouted. "I saw Mary run back. She was looking for her shawl." Without a thought, Katrina tore away from the gathering crowd and ran into the burning wing. The heat hit her like a wall, thick, blinding. Smoke curled around her face, clawing at her throat. But she pushed forward, one arm over her mouth, the other dragging her skirts out of the way. The walls, once whitewashed and bright with children's drawings, now bore streaks of soot and falling embers. She found Mary curled under a cot, her hands over her ears, her eyes wide with terror. "I've got you," Katrina whispered hoarsely, pulling the girl into her arms. The child clung to her, and with strength born of nothing but desperation, Katrina carried her back through the choking heat and out into the snow. The moment her feet hit the courtyard, arms reached for them. Someone took Mary. Someone tried to take her too, but she waved them off. "I'm fine," she rasped, but she was not fine. Her palms were blistered, red and raw from touching the scalding cot frame. Her hair smelled of smoke, her eyes burned, and her lungs felt like crumpled paper. Still, she stood tall. Behind her, the flames consumed what little remained of the eastern wing, and across the courtyard, from behind the flickering lamplight and the veil of snow, a single figure watched her. Alistair McRae stepped into view only once the worst had passed. His coat was dusted with snow, his gloves smudged with ash. He had arrived moments after the blaze had broken, having been returning from a private meeting in town. The first thing he had done was run to the school's accounting room and drag out the ledgers before the fire could reach them. Now, as the last embers flickered against the charred timbers, he crossed the stones in long strides, his expression carved from stone and fury. "You went into the fire," he said, his voice low. "I had to," she answered. "You burned your hands." "I saved a child. You could have died." She turned to him fully then, shoulders squared, hair still trailing loose and scorched across her back. "And you could have arrived sooner." The words hung between them like the smoke still curling toward the sky. Alistair exhaled. "Forgive me." His voice was not sharp. It was soft, bruised. She shook her head once, but her strength was fraying. Her legs trembled beneath her, and when she nearly stumbled on the uneven stone, he caught her before she fell. Not with force, but with a tenderness that surprised even him. She did not pull away. Later, in the quiet of the study, he wrapped her hands in cool linen soaked with a salve brought by the physician. The fire had spared her fingers, but the skin along her palms was blistered and raw. She winced only once. "Don't be brave with me," he murmured, his gaze fixed on her hands. "I don't know how else to be." He looked up at her then. "Then let me be brave for both of us. Just once." She closed her eyes. In the silence, only the crackle of the hearth filled the room. Outside, the snow still fell. The embers had died, but inside, something else had kindled. "You needn't stay," she said at last. "I'm not leaving. Not because of obligation." "No," he said, "because I'm done pretending." She opened her eyes. He was still kneeling before her, gently tying the cloth around her left hand. His fingers were steady, reverent. He looked up at her, and what she saw in his gaze was not pity nor pride, but something dangerously close to devotion. "I saw you," he whispered, "walk through fire for a child who isn't your own. I saw you take the blame before anyone assigned it. I saw you give, without asking. If I had not loved you before, I would love you now." Her breath caught. She tried to speak, but he silenced her with a look. "I'm not asking for your hand again," he said. "Not tonight. Not while your skin is burned and your name is slandered. But I am telling you this, I will not let you face the next fire alone." His words were quiet, final, undeniable, and somewhere deep inside her, something cracked, not with pain, but with release. She did not kiss him, but she placed her wounded hand gently against his chest, over his heart. It beat for her, and she felt it. By morning, the scandal had already reached the city. 3 newspapers ran the story. School fire at Lawn House. Child nearly lost, question of oversight raised, and in the corner column of the Edinburgh Daily Register, nestled beside a report of the fire and the damages, was a carefully phrased comment attributed to an unnamed gentleman of position. "The timing of the fire was convenient," it read. "With the orphanage books under scrutiny, one wonders if the blaze served more than just destruction." Katrina folded the paper with calm fingers and looked out the frost-rimmed window. Let them whisper. Let them suspect. Let them try. She had walked through fire, and she would walk through worse if it meant protecting what remained. She was no longer alone, and that, more than anything, terrified her. The city awoke beneath a thick veil of grey mist, as if Edinburgh itself held its breath. Inside Lawn House, the atmosphere was no less tense. The heavy drapes had not been drawn back. Lamps burned from dawn. The hallways were quiet. Too quiet, though steps moved with urgency, voices exchanged in hushed tones, and the air vibrated with the weight of what was coming. The hearing was set for the following morning. In the study, parchment and ledgers lay in organized piles upon the long oak table. Seals had been pressed, affidavits signed, witness accounts prepared. The ink had barely dried on Katrina's own testimony. Beside it lay her father's final ledger, retrieved from the tunnel, decoded by her hand. It contained names, dates, signatures. The cipher had unraveled beneath her relentless scrutiny, and what emerged was damning, a conspiracy of diversions, bribes, and false entries. The fingerprints of betrayal were there, plain, irrefutable, and yet it might not be enough. Alistair stood by the window, arms folded, his brow drawn. He had not slept, and it showed, in the quiet sharpness of his voice, in the pale tension around his mouth, in the subtle way he glanced toward the door every few minutes, as if waiting for something, or someone, that refused to arrive. Katrina paced slowly in the center of the room. The gauze bandages still wrapped her hands, though she no longer winced with movement. Her morning dress had been exchanged for a deeper grey wool, its high collar fastened with a single mother-of-pearl pin. She looked less like a woman in grief and more like a woman on the edge of a battlefield. "She should have arrived hours ago," she said quietly. "She will come," Alistair replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "Unless she's been warned." His eyes darkened, or silenced. The name neither of them spoke aloud hovered between them. Mrs. Kerr, the matron of the orphanage, the one person who had stood beside Katrina since girlhood, the woman who knew every hallway, every account, every locked cabinet, who had seen too much and perhaps had overheard what others had assumed would be buried. Katrina crossed to the fire, her silhouette trembling slightly in the flickering light. "If she does not appear, the case weakens," she said. "The sheriff depute is sympathetic, but without her testimony, they will say I fabricated the ledger, that I invented it out of desperation. And with the pamphlet," her voice caught. On the table lay the offending piece of inked poison, a printed pamphlet, thin but loud, distributed at dawn in the Merchant Square and along the High Street. It bore no author, no printer's mark. But its title had turned heads and opened mouths in every drawing room of Newtown. "The Fallen Lady of Lorne, Truths Behind a Widow's Ambition." Inside, it dripped venom, accusing Katrina of seduction, of inviting a man to share her house and her bed while the walls were still shrouded in mourning. It claimed mismanagement of estate funds, citing vague witnesses, and cast doubt on her father's final months, implying madness, confusion, perhaps even coercion. It was not mere gossip, it was an assault, and it had arrived the morning before her testimony. "Lord Hector is too cautious to sign his name," Alistair said, stepping away from the window. "But this bears his fingerprints. He wants to strip me of public trust," Katrina said, "so that when I speak, they only hear scandal." "Then let them hear it," Alistair said. "Let them hear every word from your mouth and burn the paper for kindling." She turned to him, eyes shining with defiance. "And what if they believe the ink?" He met her gaze without flinching. "Then let them reckon with a woman who refuses to be erased." There was a knock at the door. Both turned sharply. The butler entered, breathless. "Sir, miss, a messenger has arrived. He brought Mrs. Kerr." Katrina's knees nearly buckled. By the time she reached the sitting room, Mrs. Kerr was already seated before the fire, wrapped in a heavy tartan cloak, her boots soaked and her hands trembling. Her hair was matted to her temples. Her eyes were wild, as if she had run from something that had not stopped chasing her. "Mary hid me," she whispered. "God bless the girl. She saw them drag me out the back gate. I dropped my lantern. No one heard. They thought I was dead, perhaps." "Who were they?" Katrina asked gently, kneeling before her. "I recognized two of them from Lord Hector's Hogmanay gathering last year. One wore his crest on his signet. Foolish man. They didn't beat me. They threatened. Said if I spoke at the hearing, the children might suffer. That funds would disappear. That I'd never see my sister again." Alistair crouched beside them. "Did you hear anything about the will?" he asked. Mrs. Kerr nodded. "The factor. He boasted once in the hallway. Thought I was asleep. Said the final draft had been perfected, that no one would question the addition if it was sealed by grief." Katrina closed her eyes. Alistair stood. "That's enough," he said. "You've done more than enough." By the time dawn broke, the carriage was waiting. The hearing chamber was austere, panelled in dark wood and lined with officials whose faces betrayed nothing. Katrina stood before them without counsel, without fanfare, only with a sheaf of documents in one hand and a heart steadied by fire. Alistair stood in the back, silent, watchful, unflinching. The sheriff depute allowed her to speak, and speak she did. She spoke of her father's decline, not as weakness, but as clarity interrupted. She described the altered ledgers, the hidden passage, the ciphered records. She handed over the forged pages and laid bare the timeline. She detailed the sabotage of the carriage, the fire, the threats. She referenced the pamphlet, lifted it high, and let its weightless filth hang in the air. And then she said what mattered most. "I have no brother, no husband, no titled name to shield me from rumor, but I have truth, and I offer it not for vindication, but for protection, for the children who cannot speak, for the name my father carried with quiet pride, for the land my mother's hands once planted in spring. This is not ambition. It is duty." There was no applause, only silence, and in that silence something shifted. Mrs. Kerr spoke next, trembling but unbroken, then the physician, then the clerk. And when it ended hours later, the sheriff depute rose. "We will rule within the day," he said, and that was all. Outside the hearing room, the wind had picked up. Alistair offered his arm. She took it. And though they did not speak, the look he gave her said more than comfort. It said pride. It said faith. It said, "I saw you stand alone, and I will never let you fall." And as they stepped into the waiting carriage, the city behind them whispering still, Katrina allowed herself, for the first time in weeks, to exhale. It was just past noon when the ruling came. The panel of magistrates and the sheriff depute emerged from the recess chamber with the gravity of men accustomed to delivering judgments that could split fortunes and reputations like brittle wood. The hearing room, heavy with murmured expectation, fell into absolute silence. Katrina Lorne stood motionless beneath the high, arched ceiling. Light poured in through the tall windows of carved stone, cascading in pale shafts across the worn floors. Her gown, a deep shade of smoke grey trimmed with violet piping, clung to her with sombre elegance. Her shoulders were square. Her hands, though still wrapped in thin linen, did not tremble. Alistair Marquess stood to her left, unmoving, his jaw tight, his expression unreadable. When the sheriff depute spoke, his words were deliberate. "In review of the evidence, the court finds the will in question to be inauthentic in its latest revision, due to compromised witness accounts, forged supplemental records, and inadmissible financial behavior committed under the guise of legal administration. The revised clause of inheritance is hereby rendered void." A collective breath rippled through the room. Katrina did not move. She did not blink. The sheriff continued. "In addition, the court acknowledges the damage done by public defamation and affirms Miss Lorne's legal stewardship of the Lorne estate." A murmur began, approval, dismay, disbelief, perhaps all at once, and yet Katrina remained still, as if her body knew what her mind refused to process. It was over. The hearing adjourned moments later, and the room erupted in motion, reporters whispering, critics retreating, allies offering cautious glances of triumph. The magistrates disappeared behind closed doors once again. Mrs. Kerr wept quietly in the back row, clasping her cloak with both hands. Her voice had been small but steady in her testimony, and it had been the final crack in the facade of the fraud. Katrina remained where she was, until Alistair touched her arm. His fingers were light, the pressure barely there, but it was enough. She turned to him at last. "You won," he said softly. "No," she whispered. We survived. They left the courthouse together, though without ceremony. A modest carriage awaited them outside, drawn by a single black horse. A light snow had begun to fall, soft and cold as breath. As they climbed in, Katrina noticed the crowd that lingered, watching. Some faces she recognized, others she did not. All of them were seeing her in a new light, not as a lady, not as a scandal, but as something that neither rumor nor fire had managed to break. They rode in silence for some time. The sound of hoofbeats echoed against the buildings, the frost-covered streets near empty as the city took its midday meal. Within the carriage, the air was close and dim. Alistair sat across from her, his hands resting on his knees, his gaze unreadable. She spoke first. 3 other estates, she said. Hector's syndicate already absorbed 3. He nodded. The ledgers confirm it. Names altered, ownership shifted through shell transactions, then sold quietly through front merchants. Legal on the surface, but built on coercion. How many families? She asked. Too many. She looked down at her hands. The gauze had loosened. Beneath it, her skin was still raw. I wonder how long it would have taken them to do the same to us, she murmured. If I hadn't found the cipher, if you hadn't come. You would have found it with or without me. I don't know that. I do. She looked up, and there it was again, that quiet steadiness in him. Not praise, not flattery, but belief, not in what she had done, but in who she was. It unsettled her more than any victory. When they returned to Lawn House, the staff greeted them with a silence laced in reverence. Even the children, still huddled in the West Wing where repairs had begun, seemed to understand the weight of the moment. No one said the word trial, no one said shame. Only Mr. Lewis, the steward, bowed his head and said, "Welcome home, miss," as if it were a prayer, but Katrina felt no triumph. That night, she stood alone in the study, the room illuminated only by the flicker of the hearth. Her gown had been changed for a simpler muslin robe, the color of dusk. Her hair, unbound, spilled over her shoulders in waves she had not bothered to tame. She held the pamphlet in her hands, The Fallen Lady of Lorne. The print was smudged from her fingers, the pages softened from having been read too many times. It was no longer a weapon, it was a relic, and yet the wound it had left remained. She had stood in public and been believed, but the echo of those lies still clung to her bones. The door opened behind her. She did not turn. "I thought you would be in your chambers," Alistair said. She didn't answer. "You haven't spoken since we returned." Still, she said nothing. He stepped closer, slowly. "I thought I understood what you carried," he continued, "but I didn't." Now she turned. Her eyes were not tear-filled. They were empty. "I was prepared to lose the estate," she said, "but not to lose the person I had to become in order to keep it." He stepped into the firelight then, close enough for her to see the weariness in his expression. There was something broken in his posture, something open. "You believe you lost yourself?" "No," she said. "I fear I've become too much of myself, that I no longer know how to be anything but the woman who stands alone." He didn't speak. He looked at her, just looked. Then softly, he said, "She ran." Katrina blinked. She asked. "The woman I once thought I would marry. She ran the moment public pressure turned against me. Her name, her dowry, her father's patronage, all of it mattered more than the man she said she loved." Katrina watched him. "And yet," he continued, "you stood before a panel of strangers, knowing they'd read that filth. You stood for your father, for your house, for every servant and child under your care. You stood with your hands burned, your name in pieces, and your dignity intact." His voice lowered, "And I watched you do it without looking for a single hand to hold." Silence. Then slowly she whispered, "I didn't think one would be there." He stepped forward. "I am," he said. "I am here." The distance between them evaporated. He reached out, gently, reverently, and took her hand in his, gauze and all. He didn't press. He didn't pull. He simply held. "I don't want a marriage of necessity," he said, "not one crafted by fear or convenience. I want a life shaped beside someone who knows what it is to be forged in fire. I want you, not the name, not the estate. You." Her throat tightened. She looked down at their hands, joined in stillness. Then she looked up into his eyes, and what she saw was not demand, nor possession, nor even hope. It was certainty. Her lips parted, and for once, no words came, because none were needed. And for the first time in weeks, Katrina Lorne no longer felt alone in the room. The days that followed the court's ruling unfolded like the slow unfurling of a winter rose, quiet, persistent, and tinged with the ache of survival. The orphanage, though bruised by fire and betrayal, still stood. Its walls were blackened in places, scorched in others, and the scent of smoke clung to the timbers like a memory. But beneath the ash, the bones of the place remained, and Katrina Lorne, with sleeves rolled and shoulders squared, began to rebuild. She did not wait for others to lead. She summoned the mason herself, inspected every beam and joist, negotiated with merchants for brick and lime, and redirected household funds without hesitation. No longer did she ask for permission to protect what was hers. The children, once cowed by weeks of fear and whispers, had returned to their routines, though more quietly than before. Some still flinched at sudden noise. Others reached for her hand when she passed. Katrina gave them time and gentleness and presence. That was all she had. That was enough. From Glasgow came letters on heavy cream paper, bearing signatures of men and women she had never met. Their praise was formal, but the support was real. Donations, pledges, offers to assist the school's rebuilding. The scandal had, paradoxically, birthed respect. And for once, Katrina did not demur. She wrote back to each, her pen steady and her voice clear, signing every reply not as a grieving daughter, but as the steward of Lorne House. Alistair remained, though he no longer resided within the house. After the hearing, he had returned to his own estate for a few days, perhaps to breathe, perhaps to put distance between them. When he returned, he said nothing of his absence, and neither did she. He arrived without fanfare and resumed his quiet watchfulness as if he had never left. He offered assistance only when she was near breaking, and even then, never with pity. In truth, she did not know how to name what had begun between them. On one particular afternoon, Edinburgh lay wrapped in silence, the streets muffled by a fresh fall of snow. From her study window, Katrina watched flakes drift through a sky the colour of bone. Below, men worked with carts and sledges, hauling bricks to the damaged wing, their breath rising in plumes. Her hand ached from writing, her eyes sore from candlelight. She pressed her forehead to the window pane, the chill clearing the fog in her mind. A knock came, not to the door, but gently against the glass. She turned. Alistair stood in the courtyard below, gloved and still, a dusting of snow caught in the shoulders of his coat. He did not wave. He only looked up, waiting. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and descended without speaking. He met her at the threshold, saying nothing at first, only offering his arm. She took it without question. They walked without direction, side by side down the path that led past the gardens now stripped bare for winter. The hedges wore coats of frost, and the low wall that edged the estate shimmered faintly in the moonlight. The air between them was full of things unsaid. When they reached the edge of the orchard, he stopped. "This is where I came," he said softly, "after the fire." Katrina looked around. The snow here lay undisturbed, save for their footprints. A bench rested beneath a skeletal tree, its bark pale as ivory, its limbs reaching toward the heavens like pleading hands. "I thought I had failed you," he continued. "I watched your hands tremble as you carried that child through the smoke. I saw you bleeding from the palms, and I did nothing but catch you before you fell. And I thought, that is what I will always do. Arrive just late enough." She turned to him, her breath catching at the edge of her throat. "You didn't fail me." "I nearly did," he said, and so I asked myself whether I would always be the man who only watches from shadows, whether I would always be too careful, too proud, too late. Snow clung to his lashes now, melting into the warmth of his gaze. I have spent much of my life avoiding promises. I watched a woman I once cared for choose silence to preserve her name, and I told myself love was folly. I told myself devotion was danger. And now? She asked. He looked at her then, not as the Marquess of Stratharden, but as a man laid bare. Now I understand that devotion is not a danger. It is the thing that survives it. She blinked once, twice. Her hands were cold inside her gloves, but her chest was burning. I will not kneel, he said, and his voice was neither proud nor bitter. Not because I think you unworthy, but because I know you are not an ornament to be won. I do not bring you vows rehearsed by candlelight or jewels to soften your sorrow. What I offer is quieter and perhaps less poetic, but it is honest. She stared at him. I would like, he said slowly, to build something with you, brick by brick, not out of desperation, not because of wills or fires or fear, but because I want to see what might grow from the ashes we've endured. The orchard was still. The moonlight touched his jaw, his cheek, the faint tremor at the corner of his mouth. And suddenly she saw him, not as the man who had arrived with warnings and contracts, but as the one who had caught her as the world fell, who had held her ruined hands without flinching, who had stood at her side, not when it was easy, but when it was ruinous. She said nothing. She stepped forward and kissed him, not timidly, not with hesitation, but with clarity. Her hands rested against his chest, and his rose to cradle her face, hesitant at first, then certain. It was not a kiss born of urgency, but of decision. It said everything she had withheld. It answered everything he had asked. When they parted, neither moved. She rested her forehead against his, and in the stillness, he whispered, "Does that mean yes?" "Yes," she breathed. "Yes, Alistair." They stood like that for a long while, surrounded by snow and silence, and 1,000 things that no longer needed to be spoken. Behind them, the fire-damaged wing of the orphanage waited to be rebuilt. Before them, something else had already begun, and in her heart, beneath all the grief and ash, Katrina felt the warmth of a fire that would not burn her, but keep her. For the first time in many years, she did not feel alone. Edinburgh stirred before dawn. From the rooftops of the Royal Mile to the flags fluttering above Parliament Close, the city braced itself for royal pageantry. Bells tolled from the spires, low, sonorous and ceremonial, heralding the arrival of His Majesty. Streets were swept, uniforms pressed, and horses groomed until their coats gleamed like polished mahogany. Trumpets awaited their cue, and officialdom moved in hushed, reverent tones, as if history itself had paused to take notice. But behind the tall walls of Lawn House, another ceremony prepared to unfold, quieter, deeper, untouched by pomp or spectacle. The garden, still wounded by winter, bore no blossoms. Its paths were dusted with frost, its hedgerows bare. Yet it was here, in the very soil that had seen grief, fire and endurance, that something sacred was about to take root. Katrina stood in her chamber before the hearth, surrounded by stillness. A small fire whispered in the grate. On the escritoire lay a ribbon-tied stack of letters, well-wishes from allies, strangers, former adversaries turned admirers, a testament to battles fought not with weapons, but with courage and clarity. She wore no silk, no tiara, no veil spun by foreign lace-makers. Her gown was of warm wool in a pale silver grey, simple in its cut, modest in its neckline. The only adornment was a narrow band of embroidered thistle near the hem, a subtle homage to Scotland and to resilience. Around her shoulders she drew a dark velvet cloak trimmed in fox fur, not for fashion, but for the cold. Mrs. Kerr, still recovering from her ordeal, fastened the final clasp. "You look like yourself," she said with a smile. "No masquerade. No frills, just our Katrina. I'm not certain who our Catriona is anymore." Katrina whispered, glancing toward the frost-laced window. Then that's the best kind of bride to be, Mrs. Kerr replied gently. One who marries as herself, not as someone trained to please a stranger. Downstairs, the children waited in their best coats and mittens, clutching hand-stitched posies and dried sprigs of rosemary. No one had rehearsed. There was no organist, no formal procession. Only warmth, the kind that blooms in places scarred by storms. The makeshift altar stood beneath the great elm tree, its branches bare but proud. A ribbon of linen ran along the garden path, anchoring lanterns to guide the guests. Mica candles flickered beneath glass domes, and baskets of peat warmed the chilled air with their smoky scent. Alistair stood already in place, dressed not in aristocratic finery, but in a well-cut coat of midnight blue. A single pine sprig adorned his lapel. His boots were dusted with frost, his gloves tucked in his belt, and his face, when he turned, carried the stillness of a man who had waited years not for this moment, but for the person who made it mean something. When Katrina stepped into view, there were no gasps, no applause, only quiet. The children parted instinctively, creating a path, and she walked forward slowly, her breath mingling with theirs in soft white clouds. At the foot of the elm, Reverend Alden offered a simple bow. "We stand," he said, "not in grandeur but in gratitude, for healing, for truth, for the chance to begin again." The vows were spoken without flourish. Alistair's voice did not falter. "I give you my name, but not as a burden. I offer you my home, but not as a cage. I stand beside you, not as lord over you, but as your equal and your shield." Katrina met his eyes. "I take your name, not to erase mine, but to join it. I do not come as ornament nor servant, but as architect. Of this house, of this future, of this love, brick by brick." A hush settled, and then they kissed. Not a kiss for show or society, but a kiss born of firelight and storm, of nights spent beside broken ledgers and children's beds, of silent stairs across Ash Street courtyards. It was not fierce, it was certain. The children clapped, startled and delighted. Mrs. Kerr dabbed her eyes with the hem of her shawl, and somewhere in the distance the royal trumpet sounded. But in the garden behind Lawn House, no one turned their heads. Later, a modest feast was laid in the drawing room. Oat cakes with honey, Cullen skink, and warm cider steeped with cloves. The children sang in lilting voices, their hands still sticky from cinnamon tarts. Someone produced a fiddle, and for the first time in weeks, laughter dared to rise above the rafters. Katrina and Alistair did not disappear. They stayed. They ate. They listened. He touched her hand beneath the table only once, when her fingers trembled from exhaustion, and she pressed her thumb lightly against his wrist, as if to say, "I know. I see you. I'm here." When dusk fell, the garden emptied. The lanterns glowed dimly. Snow whispered down again, and together they crossed the threshold into the house. Not as a woman sheltering scandal, nor as a man seeking redemption, but as two who had faced ruin and chosen one another anyway. There was no procession, no carriage, no heirloom pearls, only peace, only promise. Only the 8th day, dawning not with fear but with firelight and the quiet certainty of love earned. They did not speak again that night of courts or cousins or forged wills. They had already spoken with their hands, their work, their silences, their kiss. And when the last candle was extinguished and the children all slept, the newly named Marchioness of Stratherden rested her head against her husband's shoulder and whispered only this: "We built something, and it didn't fall." Alistair smiled into her hair. "No," he murmured, "it rose." And outside, beneath a sky of white and silver, Lawn House stood warm against the cold. A house reborn, not of timber or stone alone, but of truth, devotion, and the kind of love that does not announce itself with trumpets, but endures. The bells of St. Giles rang with a quieter rhythm now, less urgent, more reflective, as snow fell over Edinburgh in the stillness of a late February afternoon. The city, having seen 2 full turns of the calendar since the scandal and fire that nearly ruined one of its oldest estates, carried on with the quiet dignity of a place that had survived much and remembered everything. At Lawn House, smoke curled upward from every chimney. The eastern wing, once blackened by flame, now stood proudly rebuilt, its new stone indistinguishable from the old. Children's laughter spilled out into the frozen courtyard as woolen coats and mittens darted across the whitewashed ground, chasing one another through a game no one bothered to name. In the nursery windows, paper stars and painted thistles hung by ribbons, reminders of a holiday recently passed and a promise newly kept. Inside, warmth ruled. Carpets lay thick over the polished floors. The air smelled faintly of cinnamon and wax. And in the study, once the domain of suspicion and falsehood, 2 cups of tea steamed gently atop the ledger-strewn table. Katrina McRae, Marchioness of Stratharden, sat with her sleeves rolled and spectacles perched low on her nose, her ink-stained fingers resting atop a report from the city council. Across from her, nestled against a knitted blanket in a wicker cradle, a sleeping infant curled into herself, oblivious to the world her mother had helped reshape. Her name was Isla. Born during the first thaw of spring, she had her father's dark eyes and her mother's fierce stillness. Already, she had become the favorite of the household, a subject of endless lullabies, unsolicited advice, and gently whispered dreams. Katrina brushed a thumb across the baby's cheek, her gaze softening. "She'll never know what it cost," she murmured. "She doesn't have to," came Alistair's voice from the doorway, quiet as always, but edged with warmth. He entered without ceremony, his coat dusted with snow, his boots still damp. He no longer moved with the guarded precision of a man who expected betrayal at every turn. These days his silences came not from distrust, but from thoughtfulness, and when he smiled, truly smiled, it changed the room. "Did the city magistrate sign the proposal?" she asked, rising to take his gloves. "He did," Alistair replied. "They'll begin building in the South Quarter by June. The first public hospital wing with women in administration. It's yours now, not just in name, in fact." Katrina blinked once, then twice. Not from surprise, but from something deeper. The relief of dreams made real. "And the man who said it couldn't be done?" she asked with a smirk. Alistair raised a brow, was reminded, gently but publicly, that women can oversee land, law, finance and infants, often all in the same afternoon. She laughed, and he kissed her cheek with reverence. Time had not lessened the quiet, growing passion between them. It had refined it. Their bond, tested in courtrooms and cellars and gardens stripped bare by winter, had become something unshakable. No longer 2 wounded strangers bound by necessity, they were now a force, steadfast, just, and endlessly intertwined. Across Scotland others had taken notice. Inverness opened a school modelled after Lawn Houses. Stirling re-evaluated its guardianship laws. And though not all minds changed, many hearts had. Lord Hectormuir had not been seen in society for over a year, after being stripped of his honorary titles and forced to pay restitution to the 3 estates his syndicate had defrauded. He lived now in quiet exile, his name whispered only as a cautionary tale of pride corrupted by greed. Mrs. Kerr, once a humble matron, now served as co-director of the Lawn Trust for Child Welfare. She walked daily with her cane, her arm linked with whatever child had earned the privilege that week, her sharp eyes missing nothing. The boys who once patched roofs and swept ash now learned to read contracts and write petitions. The girls embroidered, yes, but also studied anatomy and map-making and the works of Mary Wollstonecraft, kept proudly on the library shelves. Katrina no longer feared being alone, but she never was. And Alistair, once a man of silence and shadows, could now be found more often than not, kneeling on the drawing-room floor with Isla tucked in one arm, reading aloud from a volume of ancient Scottish myths with all the solemnity of a bishop. "Do you ever miss it?" Katrina asked him one evening, their daughter asleep against her chest, the fire low. Miss what? He asked gently. The distance, the guardedness, the safety of being untouchable. He thought for a long moment, then shook his head. No, because nothing I built behind walls ever lasted. But what I built with you stands. She pressed her lips to his knuckles, and outside the garden slumbered beneath the snow once more. There would be more trials, more changes. Children would grow, policies would falter, storms would come again, but the house would hold. And in the soft hush of winter's breath, beneath stars that had watched them from the very beginning, two souls, once wounded, now whole, kept watch together. Not over a mansion or a title or a reputation, but over a legacy born of ashes, rebuilt by truth and sealed forever by love. Some stories are not about perfection, but perseverance. The eighth day is not the tale of a woman saved by a man, nor a man rescued by love alone. It is the story of two wounded souls who chose to stand beside each other, brick by brick, through scandal, fire, and fear. It reminds us that true strength lies not in titles or legacies, but in the quiet choices we make each day, to rebuild, to protect, to believe again. Katrina Lorne dared to speak when silence would have been easier. Alistair McRae chose vulnerability over vengeance, and together they proved that even in a world bound by rules and shadows, love, real love, can rewrite the future. If this story moved you, stirred something in your heart, or gave you hope, we'd love to hear from you in the comments. Share your thoughts, your favorite moment, or simply write the word firelight to let us know you stayed with us all the way to the end. That one word helps us more than you know, and if you believe in supporting the creators who bring these stories to life, consider leaving a super thanks below. Any amount, small or grand, is deeply appreciated and helps keep the candles burning in this little corner of historical storytelling. But if support isn't possible right now, there's another powerful way to help. Share this video with someone who loves period romance as much as you do, a sister, a friend, a book club, or even just someone who needs a reminder that devotion still matters in a world that forgets. And if you're not ready to say goodbye yet, take a look at the other love stories waiting in the cards. You might just find your next favorite chapter. From all of us behind the scenes, thank you for watching, for feeling, for believing. We'll see you in the next story.